Hey, everybody. Welcome back to Conversations in Ken's Cafe. We have a wonderful guest today, someone that has developed things and taken things to a totally different level when it comes to worm castings. You guys know how much I love worms and how much the biology of worms really helps us in our gardens, etc. So, Sam, I'm we'll get into WriggleBrew in a few minutes here, but I want to know more about Sam and how you got started. What was the catalyst in Sam's young life that took him down the path into regenerative, thought in the thought process?
That's a really good question. So first of all, thanks for having me, Ken. I'm really happy to be on and in the cafe. And I had a very interesting background that was not one which you would imagine would get someone interested in earthworms or earthworm castings. I originally was a chemistry major at UCF, and I was studying a lot of different things, primarily related to pyrotechnics, because I absolutely love pyrotechnics.
You want to blow things up, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean, who doesn't, right? It's really it's a fun thing to do, and so as a at the time I was a teenager, really interested in chemistry. Ended up going to UCF to study it. I ended up encountering a really distressing phenomenon, which we have in Florida, where we have this thing called runoff, red tide, rather. Red tide, fertilizer red tide it's a byproduct of fertilizer runoff, where you have huge amounts of like nitrogen or ammonia, salts or whatever, moving through the soil, ending up in the water, ending up in lakes and rivers, and ultimately in the Gulf of Mexico or the Gulf of America now. And these cause huge fish kills. And so it was something that was a big problem at the time, and it still is a huge problem. And it happened to affect me personally because it killed a whole bunch of the fish at my favorite fishing spot where I used to go with my grandpa. And it was very upsetting and shocking. And so I went to my best friend, who's a lot smarter than I am. He was a biochem major at the time. And I asked him if there was any way we could put a stop to these fertilizer runoff events. And his idea was to tap into worm castings and use them as the basis for a fertilizer that could replace a lot of these really bad petrochemical ones and thereby not cause runoff.
Right. Not cause that red tide killing all those dang fish that we need those fish.
Yeah.
Right?
And not just for entertainment. I mean, you got to eat. It's a huge part of the ecosystem. And for me, my family's lived in Florida for a really long time. We've lived in Florida for like 7 or 8 generations. That fishing spot was used by my grandpa. It was probably used by his dad, and so on and so forth. So, if there's ever an 8th or 9th generation, where are they going to go fishing? That's a really frightening thing to think about. So,
well, and the children are our future. And, I'm a little older than you, so I would consider you that next generation down. And you're our future right now. And you've brought a whole group of people together to create WriggleBrew.
Yes.
But let's go back to you. So from that point when you realized you needed to do something, you went to your buddy, like, what can we do? Take us through that story of where you guys progressed.
Well, I went to him and he had some really good ideas. The one big one being the earthworm castings. In fact, this is where I first learned about earthworm farming, because he showed me a video of a guy in Puerto Rico farming earthworms in his backyard.
Yep.
And he was doing this just with plywood boxes, food scraps, and worms. And what was coming out the other side was this black gold, this really amazing material. So the first question that kind of came to mind is, well, if we can turn garbage into fertilizer, into really effective fertilizer, why aren't we doing that because you look at where our fertilizer comes from in the United States, it's a huge amount of it comes from natural gas, a huge amount of it shipped in from other countries, a huge amount of it's coming in from, over the seas. So there's a lot of energy and effort and time being put in to bring what really comes down to basically be poison into the country, when we could be making our own fertilizer from garbage. So it turned out there were some reasons why we're really not making fertilizer for worm castings for big farms. And so Gabe and I decided to see if we could figure out a way to kind of modify worm castings. We could engineer a system to deliver worm castings in a way that would actually work with the soil, that would actually be capable of working with the systems a farmer has. And that became a research project that lasted several years. And like you said, I ended up bringing in a lot of friends. So first was Gabe, but then I brought in my friend Italo, who was studying engineering and computer science. I brought in my friend Colin, who had some background in accounting and nutrition, and my cousin, who studied physics. So we had all these people come in and end up, putting a little piece into the pie so that it all eventually came together. And we finally got some out to farmers, and they loved it. They thought it was awesome.
Well, and that's the thing. It's the end user that uses it and sees the reaction, sees the change in their garden, their crops, etc., that really starts to open people's eyes. Now, I've been through a few of your videos, and you guys had a really wild approach for what you were feeding the worms. So tell us a little bit about that, because it's kind of off the wall racquetball. It's like, huh? What?
So there's probably two big things you're referencing. One is how we feed the worms to actually make the castings for bulk production, which is we kind of have a diet for them. We control what they're eating. We want them to eat very specific things. But then there's a second part to it where we've actually been working on getting worms to eat plastic waste. And that part is really interesting and was not originally something we were going after when we started this business. It was something we kind of stumbled upon. But I can speak to the first part briefly, because that's what I introduced. And that's, worms are organisms whose poop is affected by what you feed them. So if you have a worm bin at home, if you're doing composting, what goes in is what comes out to some degree. So it turns out, for example, in the case of earthworms, if you feed them food that's rich in defensive compounds, the kinds of compounds plants use to keep themselves safe from bugs and pests and diseases, then the manure, the casting you get out of it, also ends up full of those materials. So capsaicin, what makes peppers really hot and spicy, that's a defensive compound. If you feed it to earthworms, it ends up in their castings, and it makes spicy worm castings, which prevents bugs from attacking the plants that have them applied to them. This also applies with things like caffeine, caffeic acid. It's another polyphenol, another defensive compound. And there's many, many different kinds like that. So you control what the worms eat. You kind of control what sort of chemical outcome you have. But the other half of it, the plastic digestion piece, that's a really, really cool thing.
Well, yeah, I know everybody's been looking for ways to take that plastic waste and turn it back into the molecules that can be used. And you guys have found a way to do that. And like, I know there is other biology that eats plastic, but feeding it to earthworms, I think this is a new one in my old brain.
It's a new one. So, and this is the interesting thing. So the earthworms themselves don't really eat plastic. Some of their relatives, the larvae of beetles and other things, which have a worm kind of body plan, those guys, many of them will eat plastic, just natively. But both worms, earthworms, and larvae have bacteria in their gut that allow them to digest plastic, at least to a small degree. So our thinking was, if we can harvest those bacteria and build a kind of giant artificial worm gut, we can have it inoculated with these microbes, feed our plastic into it, and the gut will do the digestion of the plastic just like a small worm would, but on a much bigger scale. And that works really, really well. And what comes out of that is a kind of proto-poop. It's a mixture of secondary metabolites, basically digested plastic, which you can then feed to earthworms as a food source. And since it's gone through the first round of digestion, there's no more microplastics in it, there's no more toxins in it. And once you put it through that second round of digestion with actual earthworms, they're able to eat that a lot easier than, say, eating a chunk of plastic, and they poop out real worm castings from them.
Well, I often tell people, the worms don't eat an apple. They eat the biology that is inside of the apple, because it's all at that level, because they don't have a gut like we do. It's basically a hollow tube where they put biology into the mix, and that biology only consumes a very small amount of what's going through the worm, and it adds that biology in for the castings. That's where worms are so amazing. Now, you're feeding specifics to get specific results, because of what you're doing and how you're doing it. So I don't know if it's proprietary information on some of the plants and stuff you're using to get some of these results, but tell us what I guess what I'm trying to get at is there different mixes that you have for different results?
Yeah. So different biology, as you're saying, really affects the impact, or it really affects growth in different kinds of plants. So different plants respond to different kinds of microbes. Different plants respond to different nutrients. So they all have kind of like a custom requirement for the most part. So fertilizer, as it's traditionally given to plants, usually comes in the form of some kind of, treat everything synthetic. But a better way to go about it is to try and make a blend of microbiology and a blend of nutrients that has the appropriate mixture for almost every kind of plant already in it. Or to find customers who are on a large enough scale where you can work with them to actually produce a mixture specifically for their use.
So you guys do those custom mixtures for, say, a soybean farmer that comes in, and do you guys look at the soil that he's using to incorporate into that mix, or is that something you guys is a next step?
That's going to be more of a next step. But right now we do a lot. Actually, most of our mix right now is designed for soy and corn farmers.
Okay.
So that's actually who we're targeting really right now. So we send a lot out to Missouri, a lot out to Iowa, places like that, where it's being used to grow soy and corn and things of that nature. But we found that the mix that we're using right now also works really well on a lot of other things. Surprisingly, orchids, for example, seem to benefit very much from the same mixture, which was very surprising to me. But we had a woman growing African violets, and normally I think she was seeing 3 blooms a year, and she got 8 when she was using our mixture, which was really, it was awesome.
So, okay, you're generally targeting those types of crops, but you're using a broader spectrum of components in there. Have you guys been researching which plants need which components, or are you guys trying to create more of a all of the different components available in your mix so it covers everything?
Well, right now we've been going for more of a cover everything approach, because you don't know, because when you're producing at a smaller scale like we are, at a startup scale, it's difficult to know exactly where your product is going to end up being used or what circumstances. So you don't have a team that's able to coordinate that with the customer. So we've ended up trying to create a very foolproof kind of mixture that targets a lot of different things. But ultimately, we'd like to start making specialized mixes for special circumstances. It's just a matter of getting the scale up to that point. But right now, we have a mixture that works really well for gardens, and that's what we sell on our website. And we got a mixture that works really well for a handful of row crops, and that's what we're selling to those farmers.
And so is that available on your website as well, the different mixes? Like I know I've got your website up in the background here. So let me pull that up so people can see. Sure.
The stuff that comes in the bottle, so that there on the front page right there, that comes in the bottle, that's really designed for a garden use, for use in a garden bed. So it's really good for growing things like tomatoes and leafy greens, and even some varieties of fruits as well, like things like of that nature. But that's not something that you'd really want to apply to like a row crop. We do have larger quantities, which we do send to some farmers. So for example, people who grow azalea get a larger version of that. We have another version that actually goes to the row crop farmers. That's slightly different.
Okay.
So if you hit retail and landscaping orders, I think you might actually be able to see what that kind of looks like. But yeah, if you scroll down, there's a picture. On the far right, that's an IBC tote. We send a lot of those out. We just sent 15 the other day to a farm. Cool. And we're going to be sending a bunch more, I think, tomorrow. So it's a really good option because it's a very concentrated nutrient package, and it helps the farmers regenerate their soil a lot, which is really a big thing because a lot of these fertilizers that our American farmers are using right now are having negative impacts on their soil in the long run. So they're degenerating the soil. This, I think, has a really positive impact, not just on the bottom line for the first time they use it, but also for the long term, because it's helping regenerate the soil and bring it back. Yeah.
Now we do have a question, and this is my wife. Silly Lily's my wife, and we live up in Canada. So does WriggleBrew ship only to the continental US, or where do you guys ship to, and do you have any problem shipping around the world, as this is a fertilizer? Do you need government approvals?
So it really depends on where you're talking about in terms of shipping it for most countries. For Canada, we do have a distributor that can ship it to Canada, so that's not a problem. But they only do the large quantities. They don't do the garden size bottles and things of that nature. But what's been kind of worrying me right now is all this talk about tariffs and all that, how that's going to apply to fertilizer markets, because it's a concern when you talk about a product like ours, where it's a very small business. It's hard to kind of eat those costs. We do ship anywhere in the U.S., whether it's Alaska, Hawaii, or whatever. The retail stuff, the bulk stuff, we can ship that anywhere in North America. I think we've shipped that as far as Belize recently, and the Cayman Islands, and like a couple other places like that. But it's a very good question.
Okay, so like I've got one of our main chat guys. His name's Perpetual. He lives in Holland. Could you actually ship to Holland?
Not right now. I'd really like to be able to, because I know they do a lot of agriculture over there, tulips and some of the best cheese in the world and all kinds of stuff like that. So I'd love to do business with Holland, but we got to figure out how that actually works first.
Okay. Well, that's one of the things you'll have to look into in the future,
Yeah.
So you guys are eating microplastics through basically a biodigester, so a biological digester, where you're eating the plastic, you're feeding that to the worms, you're adding in different mixes of I'm assuming plants to get the different components that the plants are drawing up from the soil. Are you guys looking at adding, like, say, a C90 sea salt, where it's got the 97 nutrients in it and things like that? Are you guys doing that to help add building blocks into the mix?
We kind of want to keep it as close to the true form of a worm casting as possible. That's really been a lot of our aim, has been to just translate as much of worm casting nutrition to the application as possible. We want to modify really the biology more than we want to modify the chemical content. Because worm castings chemically, they kind of already have everything a plant needs. They have chelated nutrients of every kind. They have a really nice mixture, really nice pH. So we don't want to change that. But we might want to change, what kind of fungi they have access to, what kind of bacteria they have access to. On the topic of the plastic digestion, actually, there's a really interesting point to be made there, in that right now what we're trying to do is we're trying to have the plastic being broken down and eventually converted into worm castings. But of course, plastic itself is really just carbon. There's no real nitrogen in plastics to speak of. So that nitrogen does need to come from somewhere else. So what we're trying to do is work out a way to industrialize the worm farming, so that the worm farming is taking place with regular food waste and the digested plastic being mixed in. And that's been going pretty well. And it's,
Well, that's fantastic. And depending on the ratio you're using, because guys, worms eat fast. Like I've seen, you do a feeding in 24 hours, it's all gone or less, depending on the amount of worms you have. What type of worms are you guys using? Because there's a vast variety. Are you guys have a specific, or do you guys have multiple worms you use?
So we actually use a variety of different species, and that's what's really interesting, is some species are better at some things than others are. So not all worms are created equal. Some worms are a lot faster eaters. For example, red wiggler composters are famously really, really fast eaters. Whereas others, like Perionyx excavatus, the blue Indian, they're not quite as fast eaters, but they're really good at dealing with high salinity, temperature ranges in the extremes, and with heavy metal inundation in the soil. So by mixing and matching the different species of worms, you end up kind of getting a super mix that's better than any other. We are primarily using actually the blue Indian worms right now, because they seem to deal the best with the high temperature we have here in Florida. And so we augment them with a few other species like night crawlers and stuff like that, but they really do well on their own.
Well, that's fantastic. Are you seeing out of the back end that much of a difference in the casting itself? Like you've got the people that can actually look and see what the hell's going on, are you seeing a difference between each worm?
Absolutely. So the kind of worm and how the worm farming is done really affects the quantity and availability of nutrients. So the red wigglers, I mentioned them earlier, they eat really, really fast, but the actual nutrients that they produce aren't really all that good compared to some other species. So we use a method called UV photospectrometry to measure the degree of nutrient absorption into a liquid, in our case, just like water. So when we have water and we're mixing worm castings into it, you can actually tell how much of the nutrient has dissolved into that water based on how much light in the UV spectrum is absorbed or is not absorbed. So the absorption curve is a really, really good way to tell, and we track that for different kinds of worms. And so for red wigglers, you tend to get absorption in the about, I think it's like 0.2 to 0.3. So we'll call that 30%, 20% absorption. Whereas when you have worms of mixed species, especially with like lots of night crawlers or blue Indians, you get absorption as high as 80, 90, even 100% in the UV spectrum. So that's a significant increase in the amount of nutrients that you have dissolved. And so it's a really good thing to track.
Yeah, I had never realized that there was that much of a difference. I think that's going to shock a lot of the audience that watches this, that there would be that much of a difference in what's being broken down. Do you think, because I know there's a lot of difference in the size, would it be like, in my brain, it takes longer for it to go through the worm? I think, would that be why? Or do you guys understand why?
It's all about the biology. So the different kinds of microbes you have in the gut of the worm affect how it's able to break down the material it's exposed to and what kind of nutrition it can draw from the substrate. So as you're mentioning, they don't really eat the apple. They eat the microbes in the apple. Well, it's the same thing with any other food. The microbes are constantly, contacting all this material that they're living in. And then the worms are kind of slurping it up. They're slurping up like an enzyme slurry more than they are eating chunks of food.
Yeah.
So it ends up being a situation where if you have the right kind of microbiome in your worms and the right kinds of worms, they can make 5 times as much humic acid material as another species of worm, as like red wiggler might. So you end up with a worm bin that's been eaten through and looks like there's castings there, but the actual castings pound per pound have a lot less soluble nutrition to them.
Well, and that's something I don't think a lot of people would ever realize, that there is such a broad spectrum of availability in there with the different worms. So you've mentioned, a couple of different types. Have you guys, or how many types have you guys tried?
I've personally tried about 6 different kinds, but I mean, there are over 4,000 species. So there's almost certainly a mixture out there that is a lot better than what we've got right now. I just know that ours is a mixture that's better than any of the other commercially available ones that I'm aware of. So it's a very interesting, kind of field, because not a lot of people are investigating, the actual mechanics behind it. But yeah, I mean, there's worms that live in Australia that can grow to be 6 feet long. There's worms in Africa of, all kinds of shapes and sizes, some size of a millimeter, some grow to be, almost this big around. So all these different species diversity, and they all kind of do slightly different things. So it's, who knows what might be out there that we might be able to find and employ for the benefit of mankind.
Well, when you're talking, this round, I'm thinking of the movie Tremors and the worms coming after people. It's like, maybe we don't want to get too much into these worms.
Well, the good thing is they breathe through their skin, so it's really hard for them to get much bigger than maybe that big around or so, just because they can't get enough oxygen to keep going.
Right.
But back in the Carboniferous period, a couple 100 million years ago, I think they probably could have gotten a whole lot bigger, because we had almost twice as much oxygen in the atmosphere at that time.
Yep. Well, we had a lot bigger plants that were producing a lot more oxygen. We hadn't killed most of our, aquatic biology that produces the majority of our oxygen. That's where the red tide is really damaging to the oxygen source that's keeping us alive, right?
Usually. Oh yeah, and that's one of the bigger untalked about issues in climatology and in the world right now, because for every 1% decrease you have in oxygen content, I think it affects human IQ by like 5 or 10 points or something crazy, and not in a good way. So the more we kill the life in our oceans, the more we have oxygen levels decreasing in the planet, the stupider people get, and the harder it becomes to solve such problems. So it's
there's a direct correlation to a lot of people I know, I think, the lack of oxygen. Yeah.
Although there's something interesting to be said. The place on Earth with the highest level of oxygen concentration.
And where's that?
It's the Corn Belt in the Midwest, in the U.S.
Really?
More oxygen there than anywhere else on the planet. Even more oxygen level there than the Amazon rainforest, for example. So people in the Midwest are doing well.
Do you know why? Like, is it because I know that they only grow so many crops in a season? Like, is it the biology that's under the soil that's making this oxygen, or who's making this oxygen?
It's the corn itself. So we grow so much corn and soy that just the vast quantity of it, because all the nitrogen we're pumping into it is creating these massive, essentially blooms of corn. And so you get these huge oxygen generation events happening. You can actually observe them from orbit, from space, in different spectra of light, but you can see it. It's really kind of crazy. And so that's all corn. Now, when the season slows down, the oxygen also slows down considerably. So it's not like a renewable kind of or natural kind of production, but it goes to show just how big of an impact we are having from human activity.
Well, yeah, and that's one of the things we've been cutting down our forests, etc., knocking the oxygen levels back. And, people are always talking CO2, but the plants need the CO2. So do we, because we're all carbon-based life forms, right? We need, that carbon, and everybody seems to be so worried about it. Yet I keep thinking, okay, well, Mount Kilauea, I think, puts out more carbon in a day than, all of mankind has since the Industrial Revolution. But yet we're to blame for carbon. It's like, what?
There's a lot of complexity to it. Yeah, it's one of those things where it's difficult for humans to understand intuitively. Another part of it that's really big that a lot of people don't talk about is if you look at greenhouse gases, water vapor is far worse than CO2 is. It's, I believe, 100 times worse molecule per molecule to have water vapor than to have CO2. But water vapor is also a huge part of our exhaust. When we have cars driving around, we have factories running. It's the other part of the combustion equation. You produce water vapor and CO2. Water vapor also is the result of more evaporation. So when you have a really hot summer, you have a lot of water evaporate, which creates a temporary greenhouse gas effect from that. And there's a lot of people pushing for like hydrogen vehicles. But hydrogen's main byproduct of when you burn it is water vapor. So there's kind of a contradiction there because making hydrogen vehicles wouldn't solve your greenhouse gas problem at all. So I don't really know why people push for that so much, but maybe they just don't understand the chemistry.
I think it's a lack of education, and I got into marketing, 20 years ago, and all of this has been programmed into us to think it's this because that's what everybody says. And the more you repeat it, the more they go, oh, well, yeah, that's got to be the truth because everybody's saying it.
Well, and also it's very monetizable. So, for example, I mean, in Canada, you guys have the carbon tax. There's a lot of revenue to be made off of that.
Oh, I get upset every time I think of it. But, we have an election coming up here next month, so we're gonna hope that things are get a little bit better, and we need more oxygen up here. Okay.
Well, I'll be watching that election for sure. It's going to be a really interesting one, but it's kind of just a crazy time in space we're living in right now, where the emphasis that's happening right now for environmental stuff is not super focused on some of the things maybe it should be. Like a lot more focus, I think, should be put on protection of species. So earthworms, for example, many people don't know, many earthworm species are endangered. There's actually a good number of earthworms that are endangered. And there's a good number of earthworms that are being killed by land development. When we put up, housing and neighborhoods and stuff, especially here in Florida, for example, we plow over entire natural areas to put up big subdivisions of all these, suburbs. And when you do that, it destroys the habitat for the earthworms. And when you kill the earthworms, you kill one of the most important organisms for spreading good soil biology. And the consequence of that is the soil ends up dead, nothing grows in it. So people start putting synthetic fertilizer on it to make things grow again. And it's just a terrible feedback loop.
Well, and I think like I talk a lot about the predator prey model, and you have to have the prey species for the predators to be available. So you want birds in your area. If you don't have a food source for them, they're not going to show up and stay there. And that has a lot to do with those worms, with the biology creating the larger life forms that these birds consume, the mice consume, etc. And every time we take out a species, we're taking out a food source, which affects the next layer of life on our planet. And eventually that balance is going to tip so far where we're just going to crash and burn.
Yeah, well, I mean, you talk about the taking pieces out of the food chain. It's like pulling pieces out of a Jenga tower. And who's at the top? We are. You can only whittle away your support for so long. I mean, there's the phrase, the early bird gets the worm. But if there's no worm, there's no bird, early or not. And that's a huge issue is, we're devastating. I mean, people are really worried about like honeybees right now. And I get it. Honeybees are a big pollinator organism. It's really important to have bees. And they're cute too, which makes it marketable. But worms are just as important, yet they're not nearly as, there's not people passionate about earthworms in the same way. But you can't have life without them. Without earthworms, you don't have soil. Without soil, you don't have plants. Without plants, none of this works. And for example, on your average rancher's field, where he might have cattle or whatever, for every pound of cow he has above ground, he has to have an equivalent pound of worm below ground to support the grass to feed that cow. So if he has, 60 head of cattle, and that's, I don't know, like 80 tons or 100 tons or whatever it is, he would need that many tons of worm below the ground in order for it to actually support the cattle above ground.
That's a very interesting statistic. Oh man, the mouth is not working. I've never actually heard of that one before, but in a lot of ways it does make sense because, as above, so below. The amount of cells, and I look at it a lot differently than just having the earthworms. You need the cells, you need the biology that are breaking down the components to feed the biology in the grass that he's growing for his cows. And that biology is attracting the earthworms. So I can see the direct correlation. Now, you guys sell to a lot of farmers. Are you selling to the cattle farmers, the sheep farmers, etc., for their pastures? Is that one of your markets that is becoming aware of this?
Absolutely. Yeah. Farmers, ranchers do care a lot about what goes into the ground to feed the grass, to feed their cattle. So we have been able to actually make some headway there. We recently shipped some out to a farm. I think it had 2,500 acres where they're, they have cattle ranging and stuff like that. And it's because better grass, more grass being grown means more for the cows to eat. And so they have to, a lot of these ranches are paying for fertilizer. And if we can save them money and provide them an organic substitute, that's a win for everyone involved. Which is another big piece about this is a lot of the organic fertilizer and the organic products are locked behind a higher price point. They try and command a premium, but farmers are already squeezed enough as it is with synthetic stuff. So if you can provide an organic product that actually saves them money, then it's going to be a no-brainer for them to switch to it. You don't need to mandate them to do it. You don't need to, punish them with fees to make them do it. Just provide them something that's organic, that's going to save them money, and they'll use it. And that's what we've been doing. We've been coming under the price of a lot of synthetic fertilizers, and it's encouraging farmers to switch and use this and regenerate their soil.
Well, and you guys have been around for what, 4 or 5 years now, I think?
Actually, only really 3 years. This is our third year.
So do you guys have a lot of data that from farms already that you can share with new farmers?
Absolutely. Yeah. So that's one of the great things about this is when we first started it, it was really just research. So we gathered up a lot of data before we started making any sales. So now we have a huge amount of data that we can provide, pictures, testimonials, and things like that, which overcomes a lot of the skepticism people have because, a lot of people, when they think organic, they think ineffective. But in this case, we have an organic product that is more effective than a lot of the synthetic stuff. And so we've been able to make a lot of headway because we have results to show people, and that helps a lot.
Well, and being able to show that to a farmer, especially if they can go to somebody else's farm and see it and touch it and feel it, it makes a huge difference in their inner joy and hope for the future, because they see the health and that health of the soil, the health of the grass, the health of the cattle, the health of us when we consume the cattle. It's that loop of life that we can't get away from. It's all works together. So I know that a lot of people, like Andy Lopez, the Invisible Gardener, he makes a worm juice that he sells to people. He uses in his business. The one problem he had with shipping was because there's so much active biology creating gases. How have you compensated for that, say, to stop that life from blowing the toad apart?
And actually, that is an extremely astute question, because that was the biggest challenge we had when we first started this was, worm castings are great, worm teas are great, but they have a really short shelf life. So in the case of a lot of people who have made worm teas, they expand and produce gas and they can blow up, or in other cases, they just spoil, they go bad, real quick. Okay. So the way to get around that is we ended up kind of coming up with a way to sort of pasteurize the worm tea. So we're taking the biology out of it, and what we're doing is we're breeding the biology on the side. We're breeding it in a different medium, and then we're selecting from that the species that are actually able to go into hibernation, to preserve themselves, and we add those hibernating spores back in. And the effect of that is the worm tea is inoculated with the biology that you want, but it's not active. It's all entirely in a hibernating state because it's been separated and bred elsewhere and then put into hibernation. And so as a consequence of that, you end up with a worm tea that's not going to produce a bunch of gases. It's not going to explode. And it's also not going to spoil before the farmer gets it. In fact, when we've tested it, the shelf life is 2.5 years and up. So it lasts a really long time, which is great because, for the longest time, compost teas and worm teas, you couldn't do that.
Well, and that's one of the big problems. So is this in-house that you're taking and putting that biology into cyst?
Yep, pretty much. Cool. When we first started, we were doing it in my garage, so it was really a challenge to figure out how to make it all happen. Especially, doing a clean room in a garage is not easy. But eventually, we were able to get a large space and set up fume hoods and stuff like that. And now we can actually do that to a real large degree, and it's in fact more than enough for our industrial use. And we're even looking at breeding the microbes from the best earthworms and selling those just as dehydrated microbe mixes, so people can actually start their own cultures in their worm bins, in their compost bins, even on their farms.
Now that is something that is going to really help a lot of people, because if you can throw something like that into your compost after it's cooled off, guys, remember, don't do this when it's still hot compost. It's got to be, down to, I think, at least 120, if not below. But then you're inoculating all this vibrant life back into it. So have you guys looked at biochar and charging biochar at all with your mix of biology?
Yes, in fact, that was one of the very first things I was doing when I was starting this project, was getting really into biochar, because biochar is just a fascinating material, really high surface area, so it has all these applications as a consequence of that. And one of them is it's really good for getting microbes to stick to it and to inoculate. And so far, I've seen it works really well in tandem with biochars and things of that nature. So I think it's definitely something we'll want to pursue more in the future, because there's a lot to be done with that.
Well, I think you need to go back to the last time Quadamoc Villa was on with Leighton Morrison on the Soil Matters. He was talking about a product that Terraganics has
Yeah.
that when they're dousing, they're adding this on to get more minerals and a better charge, electronic charge on the char. So I think that would really combining that knowledge and understanding, I think, would take it to the next level.
Possibly so. And you know, it's one of those interesting things because, in fact, biochar is used right now to produce supercapacitors. They use it because it's really good at holding in lots of ions. Worm castings have a similar benefit. They are slightly negatively charged, so it's good for pulling in certain kinds of metal ions. And worm castings are fantastic chelators. They wrap themselves around lots of different molecules and or compounds and make them available for plants. So the potential to blend the two is quite high, and I think it could be really, really effective. It's just not something I've pursued yet because, you know, I've been so busy.
You've only been around 3 years, okay? You haven't had enough time yet.
No, not yet. But we've been making a lot of really good progress on the plastic digestion end of things, on getting this out to farms, and of course now we have a retail version, which is fantastic for people who have home gardens and stuff like that.
Now, and that's generally your smaller bottles. Now, are people, you know, generally doing a foliar application? Are they doing a soil drench, or what's the methodology of use for the sprays or the liquids, I should say?
Yes, well, you kind of covered. I mean, so it's one of the great things about it is, unlike a synthetic, there's no burn, there's no real bad smell. So you can use it in a lot of different ways and see really good results and see, you know, really, I mean, you can't screw it up really. That's the thing. You really cannot screw this up for the most part. I mean, unless you start drinking it or something. It can be poured. I mean, most effectively is when you get it near the root zone. So whether it's a root drench or, you know, in furrow or something like that, that's the most effective for growth. But, you know, worm castings, and by consequence our worm tea, is full of a lot of defensive compounds. So a foliar application can have really positive impacts for, you know, resistance to biotic pests, resistance to diseases, you know, things of that nature. So you can use it either way and still see good use, good results.
Well, and for you guys that don't understand, when you do a foliar spray, there's a mix there of things. You've got the components that have been broken down by the worms, but then there's also the active biology that's going to be there as well. And if it's not a biology your specific plant needs, then it becomes a food source. But if it's a biology that's missing in that plant that's going to benefit that plant, it's going to slip in like a fresh military unit coming in to help you grow more cells of your plant. And that's what it all boils down to, is cell division. Having those components is so beneficial. Having that biology that works with those components can be even more beneficial.
Absolutely. Because, you know, like you say, basically plants, they're used to having allies in the field. They're used to having microbes around to help them. They have rhizobacteria that are helping them fix nitrogen, bring in phosphorus. They have a variety of fungi that are living in their roots that are bringing in all kinds of nutrients. So they are used to having these allies nearby. So, you know, when they don't have them, it can cause some serious problems. And if you could paradrop them in, that's really, really good.
Well, and that's what a foliar is supposed to be. Like I know I do a lot of Korean natural farming, and you make, you know, water soluble calcium using, you know, biology to break the calcium out of the eggshell. But it's also the biology that can turn around and use that calcium to help build cells, as you know, we've seen with Dr. James White in horizontal gene transfer. The biology literally can go from being a plumber to, you know, an electrician, depending on the need. It can change. So the biology that broke the material out of the substrate is also the biology that can change hats and build with that substrate.
Absolutely. And on that topic too, when it comes to calcium, earthworms are really well suited to making calcium available to plants. They produce amorphous calcium carbonate, which is the very best kind of calcium for plants in terms of building up their ribosomes and doing things like that. And that kind of calcium, when we try to replicate it in the lab, when humans try to produce this kind of amorphous calcium, it has a shelf life of, a few days or weeks tops. But when earthworms produce it, they produce a kind of amorphous calcium carbonate that has a shelf life measured in months or years. So the worm castings end up having this calcium availability to a really high degree, and it lasts in the castings longer than it does anywhere else.
Well, and that, I hate to say it, but in the lab, it's really hard to duplicate nature in the truest sense, where in nature, she's building that molecule and combining the different things together in the right way where it's going to last. So I'm glad that you brought that up, because, one of the things we talk about is, biology made in the lab not being as strong as biology made in nature. And that's really, an example of that. So you've solved the blowing up problem, but let's talk about your other product here, because you actually sell a vermicompost as well. It's a water saving soil amendment, you're calling it. So what's that about? Like, you're using the worm castings, you're taking all this stuff out. Is this a byproduct of that, or is this got the full spectrum in it still?
So it is kind of a byproduct. So it's worm castings which do no longer have the soluble nutrients, but they retain all the insoluble nutrients, and we do add a little bit extra back to them to kind of build them back up. So the goal of our production is to have a like a zero waste process. So we don't want to throw any worm casting away, even if we've absorbed the nutrients out of it to make the worm tea. We want to be able to use it to actually make another product. So first, when we started doing this, we were just donating a lot to farms. But then we realized that if you mechanically process the vermicompost, and if you add in a few other things to it, you end up with a substrate that's really, really good at holding in and allowing the flow of moisture. And so we did a lot of tests on this, and we found that these worm castings are better than any other soil we have seen when it comes to actually holding that moisture present. And in a way that's not contributing to things like root rot. So in a lot of places where there's drought, or where water availability can be a problem, or where plants' roots tend to dry out, you mix something like this and you end up having really, really nice moist roots. We ended up adding chitin to it, actually, and I don't know if it's on the label you can see there, but chitin is the shell of lobster and crab. And we ended up doing that because chitin is a really big immune booster. And chitin brings a lot of essentially forewarning to a plant's biology. When a plant basically detects chitin, it produces the chitinase enzyme to break it down, and that triggers the production of things like jasminates, which are defensive compounds, the production of capsaicinoids, of polyphenols, and other things of that nature. So in essence, this is a way for you to get water retaining worm castings with an immune boost for a very affordable price, because it's already been used to make fertilizer for us.
Well, and a lot of people I come from the cannabis industry in the back end because of injuries to my body. I consume cannabis for my pain, etc. One of the things we put into our soil mixes is insect frass. And we put in these types of things because it introduces that stress to the plant. So I think this would be a good thing for people that, especially the indoor growers, to be adding something like this. Now, if say I put it in a pot, I water it in, that's all going to go through the soil structure as well to really get this cooking, correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And so when you were talking about insect frass actually earlier, it's the same compound. It's chitin. It's the same thing in both situations. So when you add this kind of soil to a plant, it's as soon as its roots are going to contact chitin, in either case, it's going to have the same kind of positive result. For growing plants in the nightshade family, we've seen some very good results, and particularly we've seen some really good results in fighting off spider mites. It seems to be that this kind of soil really brings a good resistance to spider mites, which is a big positive, benefit when you look at, how often that tends to affect plants in that industry.
Oh, and that's what actually took me out from growing was I got a huge infestation, but it's amazing because I did have 2 plants in there where the other plants were just like you could see big webs, and these other 2 plants were never touched, but those 2 plants were at a much healthier level with much thicker leaves, etc., because of the growing methodology I was using, where the weaker ones got attacked. So with your product here, you're actually able to grow healthier, thicker leaves. Spider mites, consume by sticking their, little arrows into the leaf and drawing out the moisture. If your spear is only a quarter of an inch, but the leaf is 2 inches thick, they can't get through it. So this is a product that really is going to boost that thickness so they can't feed and your plant doesn't get attacked by spider mites.
Exactly. And there's like 3 components to it. There's the, bringing up the health of the plant, making the leaves thicker, making it stronger. But in doing so, you also tend to bring up the defensive compound production of the plant. So it's making more of its own compounds to fight off these kinds of pests and diseases, even if they do puncture through the skin. And then third, it has the chitin in it. Both the WriggleBrew and the vermicompost has the chitin. And the chitin causes that preliminary immune response, so the plant is on guard before the attack even comes.
Well, and that's really important for a lot of crops, whether that's, whatever. Like I like to say, however you grow, whatever you grow, just grow, because, it all comes down, guys, to, any plant is an organic. We're organic. Animals are organic. It comes down to that cell division, giving the biology the components necessary for building healthy cells. And that's what you guys have created in your mix, is you're giving all these components, and then the biology that works with those components. You can't help but have a healthier environment for your plants, your animals, and ourselves.
Absolutely. And that's one of the really great things I see about this in the future, is it's not just rebuilding the soil. It's not just rebuilding the health of a given crop for a given farmer, but it's going to help rebuild the health of the people who actually are going to eat these plants and are going to make use of them. There's one of the really big illustrative phenomenon of this in recent history is we look at the declining nutrient value in our plants. So you look at rice crop, for example. Rice crops today are many times less healthy in terms of the nutrients they provide you than they were a couple of years ago. The crops, for example, in Florida, we grow a lot of citrus here, right? Florida's famous for our oranges. Our oranges today are 6 times less nutrient dense than they were in the 1970s. 6 times less nutrients. So you have to eat 6 times as many oranges to get the kind of vitamin D and C and all that other stuff you used to get out of them. And when we look at places like India and China, where there are people living off of a diet in many rural areas that is almost entirely rice-based, that's their staple crop, and almost all they're eating, the use of phosphorus fertilizers has reduced and depleted the quantity of available zinc to such a degree that the rice that's being produced is almost completely deficient in zinc, and it's causing tens to hundreds of thousands of child deaths a year from essentially the suppression of their immune system, because children need zinc in order to build their immune system up. So you have these children getting the kind of diet that would have been fine for their parents, but is now deadly to them. And nothing has changed except the chemicals that we're using to grow their food.
And like Margaret says, how sad is that?
It is a tremendous human tragedy, because everyone involved in this process is really trying their best. They're trying these farmers are using the fertilizers that they're seeing good yields with. The parents are giving their children the amount of food that they ate growing up, and it's just not enough anymore because of chemical byproducts and effects that were totally unanticipated. And
whatever they're using as chemicals has, I guess would be killed the biology that mines zinc to put it into the plant. So it's a direct correlation. Now, you were talking about, a few years ago for the oranges. Go back to the 20s and look at that far back. You're eating bushels of oranges to get the same amount as one orange would give back in the 20s before the chemicals started being used. It was always, a short-term gain, never long-term. I hate to put it in the principle of, a conspiracy theory, but why is it still propagating after we know so much, yet we're still doing the same thing? Like, that's, what do they call it? The height of stupidity is to keep doing the same thing and think it's going to change the result.
Absolutely. And I mean, we knew as far back as probably the 20s or 30s that these fertilizers were not really the best thing for plants. But they're cheap to manufacture, they're easy to make, and they're really profitable. And so, there's that saying, never assume malice where ignorance will suffice. Well, I think there was maybe a bit of greed and ignorance that combined, and that's oftentimes
a little,
maybe a lot, maybe a lot. But I think sometimes you combine greed and ignorance, that can be just as deadly as any amount of malice.
Oh yeah, definitely. Now, I do want to get to this question from Margaret. How can I properly store a huge tote of worm castings, and for how long?
So it's an interesting question. So for our product, which is the worm casting tea, to properly store it, you really just need to put it somewhere shaded. So it just, as long as it's not access to direct sunlight and it's not going to freeze, you can store it as its liquid form for at least 2.5 years. So in a well-insulated barn, or, if you're somewhere where it doesn't freeze, somewhere under cover or shade is fine. For worm castings themselves, the best way to store them is you kind of want to keep the moisture in. So, maybe put them, if you got a whole bunch of worm castings, maybe put them in a pile somewhere with some cloth over the top of them. Just a basic tarp will do. You want to keep the direct sunlight away from it. Same thing, because you're trying to protect that biology. You want to keep some of the moisture in. And worm castings are generally good for, I would say, 6 months to 1.5 years for optimal use. You can use them, 5-10 years later, and they're still going to be good, but maybe they'll be half as good as when they started.
Now, I'll give you guys a little example on how good worm castings, especially fresh worm castings, are. You guys know I make gel caps to consume my cannabis. Well, I was using gel caps, and I was, because I consume worm castings, guys, because our belly and our gut biology is along that same line and needs it. But I took fresh worm castings and tried to do gel caps. My gel caps were melting. The biology was eating them so fast. I had to dry out the worm castings to be able to put them into the gel caps. So that's how much biology active in fresh worm castings. It's amazing how fast they can work and destroy a gel cap.
It is crazy how I've seen them eat agar, which is a food we use to cultivate microbes, extremely fast. Within a matter of days, they take a full cup of it and shrink it down to like half size. They're really amazing little guys. But interestingly, if you want to get some of the bacterial benefits of worm castings without having to actually eat worm castings, the Japanese make a food called natto, and it has one of the most important bacteria in it, Bacillus subtilis. It's pretty much that food. So natto, if you're interested, it's a little easier than eating worm castings, at least mentally, I think. But
I have no problems eating worm castings. I know some people go, "Oh my god," but then I have no problems, taking a good compost and making a compost liquid and drinking that, because it's full of the biology. Our bodies need the biology. We're lacking as much as our soil because we're not getting it from the food that we're supposed to have, that biology in. And it's not just the biology, but the building blocks from the biology that's in the worm castings. Like we were talking, your mix is so high in all of the different components necessary. our bodies need a lot of those same components. Although I go a lot more to the carnivore end because I'm not green inside. I'm kind of red, okay? So
Pinkish, you know.
yeah, I would rather feed all that green stuff to the cow that can break it down in the 4 stomachs they have, you know, and then put it into their cells, and I consume that. But how about the freezing of worm castings? Because I know somebody in the comments said, "Oh my God, I've let my worm castings freeze." How detrimental is that, or are they just is the biology more going to cyst?
When you're definitely gonna lose a lot of biology when things freeze. When things freeze over, things start to die. They start to, you know, the cells break. So you want to try and avoid that as much as possible. But if your worm castings did freeze and now they've thawed, and maybe you can have them worked by worms again a little bit, or at the very least, put them somewhere where they have access to other soil microbiology, there's a good chance they'll just get recolonized.
Okay. Yeah, I know, like I've got probably 20 pounds of worm castings I've made, and I just keep them. They're in my old grow, but they freeze all winter, and then how I use them is I put them in a lady's pantyhose, just the knee highs.
Yeah.
And I soak it in water to bring the moisture content back up to invigorate some of the biology, and then I just spray it out through my sprayer.
It's a great way to do it. In fact, actually, I've used nylon diesel filter bags. I've used cheesecloth.
Paint bags.
Yep. Yes,
Yep.
it all works. So, just something to kind of hold back the insolubles from clogging up whatever you have.
Well, yeah, it's more about not clogging the sprayer than anything else, right?
That's exactly right. I mean, if you're not going to spray, if you're just going to pour it, you don't even need to bother with that.
Yeah,
just make a slurry out of it and go nuts.
Well, my friend, we're at an hour. I know I've got you coming on with Leighton Morrison as well on the Soil Matters in a few weeks, but I'd really like to have you come back on for more conversations with me as well. There's so much more. We never got into the saxophone behind you because you play music, you're into outdoor sports and etc. And we never got into that.
I know.
Energetic flow, because a lot of it's energy, frequency, vibration. This all works together. But Sam, thank you so much for sharing what you have created and your team has created. I'd love to talk to your team as well. But guys, I'm being told that there's another question, but what is the one that you copy? Okay. That's the wife comes down from her office upstairs and says, "You missed one. What was all these worms and microbiology taught you about our world, its functions, and our experiences with it all?"
That's a great question to end it on. And I think the number one lesson I have learned from all the little discoveries we've made along the way is just how interconnected everything is, just how vast this web of life is. It's huge. It is utterly incomprehensibly massive. And the more you learn about it, the more you realize you've just barely scratched the surface. So I would say there's a lot more to be discovered. There's a lot more to find going down the wormhole, and it makes me happy and excited to think about it. And it's been a pleasure to be on the show.
Well, and there's so much more to come, guys. Remember, in another hour, Leighton's going to be on. He's going to be talking, going more over his journey. So we're going to be taking when he got into the biological side of things, and where he's come to with soil, etc. So you guys are going to want to check that out here in an hour's time. Sam, thank you so much. We'll have you back on soon. But guys, we'll see you guys soon.